The phone felt heavier than it should have as I held it against my ear, listening to my son's voice carry across the static distance between us. Outside, November rain tapped against my kitchen window in that persistent way it has, each drop finding its own path down the glass like tears I wouldn't allow myself to shed. The conversation had started ordinarily enough, his usual Wednesday evening check-in, the dutiful call that had become routine since Harold's death 3 years ago. We'd covered the weather, Emma's school project on the solar system, and Sarah's promotion at the marketing firm. Normal topics, delivered in the careful tone we'd both perfected, polite and surface level, skimming across the deeper waters neither of us seemed willing to navigate. But then something had shifted. A pause that lasted too long, a clearing of his throat that suggested preparation for something difficult. "Mom, I've been thinking about Christmas," he'd said, and I'd felt my stomach tighten with an anticipation I couldn't name. With Sarah's parents coming this year, and Emma's school play rehearsals taking up so much time, and Sarah's mother still recovering from her hip surgery. The words had tumbled out in a rush, building towards something I could sense but didn't want to acknowledge. Each phrase was another brick in a wall I could feel rising between us, constructed with the careful politeness that had characterized so much of our relationship since Harold's passing. "Just don't show up for Christmas this year, Mom." He said it as if he were asking me to pick up milk. Casual. Matter of fact. As if 43 years of Christmas mornings could be erased with 8 simple words delivered in the same tone he might use to decline a dinner invitation from an acquaintance. The words hung in the air between us, and I found myself studying them as if they were a foreign language I was trying to decipher. Don't show up. As if my presence at Christmas had become an imposition rather than a tradition. As if the woman who had spent decades creating the magic he now took for granted was suddenly surplus to requirements. I didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of my own breathing and the distant murmur of his family in the background, my daughter-in-law's laugh, sharp and bright, and my granddaughter's voice calling out something about ornaments. Life continued, animated and warm, in a space that no longer included me. In that silence, I could hear the television playing some children's program, could almost see the scene, Sarah curled on the sofa with her laptop, probably working on some project that couldn't wait until tomorrow, Emma sprawled on the floor with her art supplies scattered around her like fallen leaves. The comfortable chaos of a family evening, the kind Harold and I had treasured when Michael was small. "Michael," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "Are you certain that's what you want?" Another pause, shorter this time, filled with what might have been guilt or simply impatience. "It's just. It would be easier this year. Sarah's parents are coming, and with Emma's school play rehearsals, and the whole thing with Sarah's mother's hip surgery recovery. It's going to be cramped, you know? Maybe next year we can." I set the receiver down in its cradle with a quiet click. Not a slam. Not a dramatic gesture born of anger or wounded pride. Just a simple, definitive click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of my kitchen. The sound hung in the air like the last note of a song, final and irreversible. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still resting on the phone, feeling the weight of that click settle into my bones. The rain continued its patient work against the window, and somewhere in the house, the old radiator hissed and settled, sounds that had been the soundtrack to my solitude for the past 3 years since Harold died. The kitchen around me felt suddenly foreign, as if the conversation had somehow altered the molecular structure of the familiar space. The blue ceramic canisters Harold had given me for our 30th anniversary still sat in their neat row on the counter. The small stack of mail, mostly catalogs and bills, still waited by the toaster where I'd left it that morning. The crossword puzzle, half finished in my careful handwriting, still lay open beside my cooling cup of tea. Everything was exactly as it had been 20 minutes ago, but something fundamental had changed. Some invisible thread that had connected me to my old life had been severed with the same quiet finality as that phone call. In 3 weeks, I would be a stranger to my own life. And I would, for the first time, be home. But I didn't know that yet. In that moment, standing in my kitchen with the phantom weight of the phone call still pressing against my ear, I only knew that something had shifted. Something fundamental and irreversible. A door had closed somewhere, but I could hear, faintly, the sound of a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. The silence after the call forced a look inward, and what I found there surprised me with its clarity. I walked to my favorite chair, Harold's old reading chair, really, though I'd claimed it after he passed, and sank into its familiar embrace. The leather was worn soft in all the right places, shaped by decades of evening reading and quiet conversation. This was where I'd sat every Christmas Eve for the past 20 years, wrapping last-minute gifts and watching the snow dust the windowsill, anticipating the warmth of the next day's gathering. Harold had bought this chair the year Michael started high school, a celebration of his first promotion to department manager at the insurance company. "A man needs a proper chair," he'd said, running his hands over the smooth leather with the satisfaction of someone who rarely indulged in luxuries for himself. But it had become mine by default in those final months of his illness, when I'd spent long nights in it, watching him sleep and trying to prepare myself for a future I couldn't quite imagine. Now, sitting in it with the November dusk gathering outside the windows, I began to trace the thread that had led to this moment. It hadn't been sudden, this exile from my son's Christmas table. It had been gradual, so subtle that I'd barely noticed the slow erosion of my place in their lives. Last Christmas, Sarah had helped me with my coat before I'd even finished my coffee, her hands gentle but insistent on my shoulders. "You must be tired, Mom," she'd said, though I hadn't mentioned being tired. The drive back can be tricky in the dark. It was barely 4 o'clock, and the winter sun was still painting long shadows across their hardwood floors. I protested mildly, said I was fine, that I was enjoying the conversation. But Sarah had been firm in that polite way she'd perfected, the way that made disagreement seem churlish. "We just worry about you driving alone," she'd said, and Michael had nodded from the kitchen where he was loading the dishwasher with the mechanical efficiency of someone avoiding a conversation he didn't want to have. I'd left that day with a container of leftover turkey that I hadn't asked for and a feeling I couldn't quite name, something between dismissal and concern, as if I were a delicate object that needed to be handled carefully and then put away safely. The Christmas before that, I'd brought my traditional stuffing, the recipe Harold's mother had taught me when we were newlyweds. It was a simple thing, bread and sage, celery, and onion, the basic building blocks that had anchored every holiday meal for 40 years. But when I'd arrived, arms full of covered dishes and the familiar anticipation of contributing to the feast, I'd found that Sarah had already prepared a more contemporary version with cranberries and quinoa. "I thought we'd try something new this year," she'd said brightly, gesturing toward her glass dish with its artful arrangement of colorful ingredients. "I found this recipe in a wellness blog, and it's supposed to be much lighter." My dish had sat untouched on the counter throughout the meal, eventually finding its way to the refrigerator in a container that would be returned to me, still full, when I left. No one had mentioned it directly, but I'd understood the message. My contributions were no longer necessary, my traditions no longer relevant. I thought of all the times I'd arrived to find dinner already in progress, the conversation flowing around topics I wasn't part of, school board meetings where I had no vote, neighborhood drama involving people I'd never met, work politics that didn't include me. I'd become a guest in what had once been a family gathering, my presence acknowledged but not necessary, my contributions polite but redundant. The gradual nature of it had made it almost impossible to resist. Each incident could be explained away, rationalized as consideration for my age, my comfort, my presumed preferences. Sarah's parents lived 3 hours away and visited rarely, of course, they should take precedence when they came. Emma's schedule was increasingly complex, of course, that needed to be the priority. I was alone now, with no competing obligations, of course, I could be flexible. But flexibility, I was beginning to understand, had become invisibility. Accommodation had become erasure. Dignity is a quiet thing. You don't notice it's gone until you feel the cold. Harold used to say I was too accommodating, too willing to bend myself into whatever shape others needed. "Stand up straight, Catherine," he'd tell me when I'd apologize for taking up space or defer to someone else's preference when I'd been asked for my own opinion. "You're allowed to cast a shadow." He'd said it with love, usually while pulling me closer to him on the sofa or squeezing my hand across a restaurant table. But there had been an edge of frustration in it too, the particular exasperation of someone watching a person they loved diminish themselves unnecessarily. After he died, it had seemed easier to make myself smaller, to fit into the corners of other people's lives rather than insist on my own space. Michael and Sarah had their own family, their own traditions, their own rhythm. I told myself I was being helpful by adapting, by not making demands, by accepting whatever role they had room for. Grief, I'd discovered, had a way of making you grateful for scraps. In those first raw months after the funeral, any inclusion felt like mercy. When Michael called to check on me, when Sarah invited me to Emma's school play, when they included me in their holiday plans, it felt like lifelines thrown to someone drowning in solitude. I'd been wrong. Not about being helpful, but about what help actually looked like. True help didn't require me to disappear. True love didn't ask me to become invisible. Sitting in Harold's chair, watching the November rain trace patterns on the window, I understood something with startling clarity. I had been asking permission to exist in my own family. And today, that permission has been revoked. The understanding settled over me like a heavy coat, warm and protective. I wasn't angry, anger would come and go, but this was something deeper. This was recognition. This was the moment when you stop asking for a seat at a table and start building your own. The house around me seemed to exhale, as if it too had been holding its breath, waiting for me to see what had been obvious to everyone but me. The kitchen where I'd fed my family for decades, the living room where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays, the dining room where we'd hosted Thanksgivings and anniversaries, it was all still here, still mine, still capable of holding life and love and meaning. I just had to remember how to live in it. I made tea then, because that's what you do when the world shifts beneath your feet. You put the kettle on and you wait for it to sing. The ritual is soothing, the measure of loose leaves, the warming of the pot, the patient steeping that can't be rushed. Harold had laughed at my tea ceremony, calling it unnecessarily elaborate, but he'd always accepted the cup I offered with gratitude. You could just use a tea bag, you know, he'd said more than once, watching me go through the familiar motions. I could, I'd always replied. But then it would just be hot water with flavor. This is tea. The distinction had seemed important then, though I'd never been able to articulate why. Now, standing in my kitchen with the kettle singing its familiar song, I understood. The ceremony wasn't about the tea, it was about intention, about taking time, about honoring the simple acts that anchor us to ourselves. While the tea steeped, I found a notebook, not the grocery list pad stuck to the refrigerator, but a proper notebook with lined pages and a firm cover. I'd bought it months ago with some vague intention of journaling or planning, but it had sat empty in the kitchen drawer, waiting for a purpose worthy of its clean pages. The leather cover was soft under my fingers, dyed a deep burgundy that reminded me of wine or autumn leaves. Harold would have liked it, he'd always been drawn to well-made things, objects that spoke of permanence and care. Inside, the paper was thick and cream-colored, substantial enough to hold whatever weight I was about to place on it. I opened it to the first page and wrote, "Things I no longer owe." The list came easily, as if it had been waiting inside me for permission to exist. I no longer owe anyone an apology for taking up space. I no longer owe anyone a smaller version of myself. I no longer owe anyone my presence at events where I am not wanted. I no longer owe anyone access to my resources without my consent. I no longer owe anyone explanations for choices that harm no one. I no longer owe anyone the right to interrupt my peace. I no longer owe anyone my silence in the face of dismissal. On the facing page, I wrote, "Things I am reclaiming." This list required more thought, more courage. My Tuesday evenings, no longer reserved for babysitting. My holiday traditions, the ones that matter to me. My financial privacy. My right to say no without providing reasons. My own keys to my own life. My voice in conversations about my own future. My capacity for joy that doesn't depend on others. As I wrote, the tea grew strong and bitter, but I drank it anyway. Something was fitting about the astringency, the way it demanded attention, refused to be ignored or pushed aside. Each sip was a small act of defiance against the sweetened, diluted version of myself I'd been offering to the world. The rain had stopped while I wrote, and the kitchen had grown dark around me. I switched on the small lamp over the sink, creating a pool of warm light that made the notebook pages glow like candles. Outside, the November evening settled over the neighborhood with that particular stillness that comes after rain, when the world seems washed clean and ready for whatever comes next. In that pool of light, with my lists complete and my tea finished, I looked up the number for my old bank, the one I'd used before Harold and I consolidated everything into the joint account at the branch near Michael and Sarah's house. It had seemed practical at the time, easier for Michael to help with my finances as I aged. But practical had become controlling, and helpful had become infantilizing. I would call them tomorrow. Tonight, I would sit with my own thoughts, without tears, just purpose. A door had closed. But a key was turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of December day that makes your breath visible and your cheeks sting. I'd slept better than I had in months, waking not to the usual anxiety about how to fill the empty hours ahead, but with the focused energy that comes from having a plan. I dressed carefully, not formally, but with intention. My navy wool coat, the one Harold had bought me for our anniversary 3 years before he died. He'd surprised me with it, bringing it home in a garment bag and hanging it in the closet without saying a word, waiting for me to discover it. "Harold, what is this?" I'd asked, running my hands over the soft wool, the careful tailoring, the buttons that felt substantial and well-made. "A coat for a woman who matters," he'd said simply. "I got tired of watching you shiver in that old thing." The scarf that brought out my eyes, silk, in a shade of green Harold had always said matched the color of spring grass. The boots that gave me an extra inch of height and made a satisfying sound on pavement, announcing my presence rather than apologizing for it. The bank was busy with morning customers, people conducting the small financial transactions that keep life running smoothly. I took a number and waited for my turn, using the time to observe the other customers, to remind myself that I was not the only person in the world dealing with money, accounts, and the business of independence. The young woman who called my number had kind eyes and efficient hands, the sort of person who had learned to balance genuine care with professional competence. She listened to my request without judgment, without the patronizing concern I'd been bracing myself for. "You'd like to reopen your individual account, Mrs. Thompson?" "Yes. And I'd like to transfer funds from the joint account I share with my son." "Of course. Do you have the account numbers with you?" It was that simple. No permission required, no explanations demanded. The money was mine, the choices were mine, and the future I was building was mine. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mrs. Thompson?" she asked, sliding the new debit card across the desk toward me. "Actually, yes," I said, surprised by my own boldness. "Could you recommend a good solicitor? I need to review some legal documents." The card felt solid in my hand, substantial. A key to doors I'd forgotten I could open. The solicitor's office occupied the second floor of a Victorian building downtown, the kind of place that spoke of tradition and permanence. The waiting room smelled of leather and old paper, serious and established, with hunting prints on the walls and magazines that assumed their readers were interested in estate planning and investment strategies. Davies was younger than I'd expected but spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of words. His office was lined with law books and family photographs, creating an atmosphere that was both professional and personal. We reviewed my will first, a document I hadn't looked at since Harold's death, when everything had seemed much more fragile and my future much less certain. Then the power of attorney, the medical directives, the legal architecture of my life that I'd assembled years ago when planning for old age had felt like a distant necessity rather than an immediate reality. "These documents give your son quite a bit of control," he said gently, looking up from the papers spread across his desk. "Is that still what you want?" I thought about the question, really thought about it. When Harold and I had drawn up these papers, it had made sense. Michael was our only child, responsible and caring. We'd assumed that our interests would always align, that what was good for us would be good for him and vice versa. The idea that our paths might one day diverge, that love and duty might not be enough to bridge the gap between different visions of my life, hadn't occurred to us. No, I said. I'd like to make some changes. The new documents would take a week to prepare, but the conversation was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Davies asked questions that forced me to think clearly about what I wanted, what I valued, and what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. Not just a financial legacy, but the example of how to live with dignity and purpose even in the face of loss and change. I'd also recommend changing the locks on your house, he said as we wrapped up our meeting. Just as a precaution. It's always wise to know who has access to your home. I was not erasing myself. I was underwriting my own future. The locksmith arrived the next afternoon, a cheerful man in his 60s who whistled while he worked and didn't ask unnecessary questions. He moved through my house with the easy competence of someone who had spent decades helping people secure their homes, their privacy, their peace of mind. These old locks, he said, examining the front door hardware. Pretty much anyone with basic skills could get through them. You want something more secure? Yes, I said. I want to know exactly who can come and go. The new keys felt different in my hand, sharper, more purposeful, more substantial than the old ones that had been copied and shared and distributed over the years. I gave one to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had always been kind and discreet. The others I kept for myself. That evening, I stood in my kitchen and really looked at it for the first time in months. When had I stopped seeing it as mine? When had it become just a place I passed through, a staging area for my presence in other people's lives? The counters were clear but impersonal, wiped clean of the small signs of active cooking and eating. The windowsill that had once held herbs and small flowering plants was empty except for dust and rain spots. The refrigerator held the basics, milk, eggs, bread, but none of the small luxuries I used to enjoy. When had I stopped buying myself flowers? When had I stopped baking the bread that filled the house with warmth and made strangers stop on the sidewalk to breathe in the smell? The kitchen had become functional rather than nourishing, a place where I prepared solitary meals with the minimum of fuss rather than the loving laboratory where Harold and I had experimented with new recipes and entertained friends and created the small daily magic that makes a house a home. I began the next day with a trip to the garden center. December wasn't the season for planting outdoors, but the greenhouse was warm and humid, filled with the green promise of spring and the particular hope that comes from tending growing things. I chose a small lavender plant for the kitchen windowsill, something hardy that would fill the space with gentle color and fragrance, something that would remind me that beauty didn't have to be complicated or grand to transform a space. The young man at the checkout counter gave me detailed instructions for care, his enthusiasm infectious. Lavender's great, he said, wrapping the pot carefully. It's tough, smells amazing, and you can use it for cooking or tea. Plus, it'll bloom again if you take care of it. Mrs. Chen was in her front garden when I returned, bunding rose bushes against the winter cold with the methodical care of someone who understood that investment in the future required present moment attention. We'd been neighbors for 8 years, but our conversations had always been limited to pleasantries over the fence, comments about the weather, brief updates on our families, the polite exchanges that maintain neighborhood harmony without requiring actual intimacy. That's a lovely plant, she said, straightening up from her work and nodding toward the small pot in my hands. Thank you. I thought it was time to bring some life back into the kitchen. Something in my tone must have invited confidence, because she pulled off her gardening gloves and really looked at me, studying my face with the attention of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of change in people she cared about. Are you all right, Catherine? You seem different lately. Lighter, somehow. For a moment, I considered giving her the polite deflection I'd perfected over the years, the bright smile and vague reassurance that kept conversations surface level and safe. But the new keys were heavy in my pocket, and the lavender smelled like possibility. "I'm finding my footing again," I said. "It's been a while since I've done anything just for myself." She smiled, and I noticed how it transformed her whole face, bringing warmth to her eyes and softening the lines around them. "Would you like to come in for tea?" I was just about to put the kettle on. Her kitchen was everything mine wasn't, lived in, personal, filled with the accumulated treasures of a life fully inhabited. Photographs covered the refrigerator, not just the formal portraits that mark major milestones but candid shots that captured ordinary moments of joy. Plants crowded the windowsills, some flowering, some simply green and thriving. The air carried the lingering scent of ginger and star anise, evidence of morning cooking and the kind of active household that creates its own atmosphere. "My husband thinks I have too many plants," she said, filling the kettle and gesturing toward the collection of pots and hanging baskets that made the room feel like a garden. "But I tell him, after 40 years of marriage, a woman needs something that's just hers, you know?" I did know. For the first time in months, I knew. We talked for an hour, about gardening and cooking, about the neighborhood changes and the way winter light looked different every year. She told me about her daughter's new job in Seattle, her grandson's struggles with mathematics, and her own recent decision to go back to painting after a 20-year hiatus. "I kept saying I'd get back to it when I had time," she said, refilling my cup with tea that tasted of flowers and warmth. "But you know what I realized? Time isn't something you find, it's something you make. Life's too short to live for other people's schedules." When I left, she pressed a small container into my hands, the plastic still warm from whatever she'd stored inside. "Starter for sourdough bread," she said. "It's been in my family for 30 years. Feed it regularly, and it will feed you for the rest of your life." That evening, I baked bread for the first time since Harold died. The process was meditative, mixing, kneading, waiting for the rise. Each step required attention, presence, the kind of focused engagement that makes time slow down and expand. The kitchen filled with warmth and the complex, yeasty smell of life creating itself, transformation happening at its own pace according to its own rules. When I pulled the loaf from the oven, golden and singing as it cooled, I understood something profound. The bread was more than food, it was evidence of care, of patience, of faith in the future. It was proof that I could create something nourishing and beautiful with my own hands, that I didn't need permission or company or occasion to make something worth making. For years, my heart had been their home. I had forgotten how to warm my own hands. I ate the bread while it was still warm, slathered with butter and honey, standing at the kitchen counter in my stockings and watching the December dusk settle over the garden. It was simple and perfect and entirely my own, the kind of moment Harold and I used to treasure, when the day's work was done and the evening stretched ahead with no obligations except to each other. The video call with Emma came at 7 o'clock, just as I was finishing the dinner I'd made for one, a proper dinner with vegetables and candles, not the hurried sandwiches I'd been eating for months. I'd forgotten the pleasure of setting a table for myself, of treating my own company as worthy of attention and care. "Grandma." Her face filled the tablet screen, gap-toothed and glowing with the unfiltered joy that only children possess. Behind her, I could see the familiar chaos of their family room, toys scattered across the floor, backpacks dumped by the door, the comfortable disorder of a household where 3 people were actively living their lives. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, settling into my chair with the tablet propped against a stack of books. "How was school today?" "We're practicing for the Christmas play, and I get to be a star. Not like a movie star, but a real star in the sky. Mom made my costume, and it has sparkles and everything." Her excitement was infectious, bubbling over in the way that made me remember why I'd loved being a mother, why I'd treasured every small discovery and achievement. This was what I'd been missing in those formal holiday gatherings, the unguarded enthusiasm, the simple pleasure of sharing good news with someone who cared. "That sounds wonderful. Will you sparkle when you move?" "Yes. And I get to say important lines about following the light and not being afraid of the dark." We talked about her play, about the book she was reading, about her friend Sophie's new puppy, and the snow she hoped would come before Christmas. Ordinary conversation, the kind that weaves relationships together one shared moment at a time. Then her expression grew serious, the way children's faces do when they're preparing to ask a question they know might be complicated. "Grandma, Mom said you might not come for Christmas. Are you sick?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was meant to wound, but because it was asked with such genuine concern. In my granddaughter's world, the only reason someone would miss Christmas was illness or some other unavoidable catastrophe. The idea that an adult might choose absence over presence, that love might require distance, was beyond her understanding. "No, sweetheart," I said carefully, choosing my words with the precision required when talking to children about adult complexities. "I'm not sick." Sometimes grown-ups need to make difficult decisions about how to spend their time. "But you always come for Christmas. You make the best stuffing, and you let me help with the cookies, and you tell stories about when Daddy was little." The pain in my chest was sharp and clean, like breathing winter air. But underneath it was something else, a fierce, protective love that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with choice. This child, with her sparkling costume and her important lines about light and darkness, deserved better than a grandmother who came when summoned and left when dismissed. "I love you very much, Emma," I said. "That will never change, no matter what. And I will always want to hear about your school play and your friends and everything important to you. Can I call you? Like, by myself sometimes?" I glanced toward the kitchen, where the new phone, my own line, with my own number, sat on the counter. Another small step toward independence, another way of ensuring that my relationships could exist on their own terms rather than as branches of someone else's tree. "Yes," I said. "You can call me anytime you want. I'll give your mom my new number." Love does not need a permission slip from the person standing in its way. We talked for another 20 minutes, about her play and the snow she hoped would come, and the book she was reading about a girl who discovered she could talk to horses. When we said goodbye, she blew me a kiss through the screen, and I caught it with both hands, pressing it to my heart. After the call ended, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about the choices I was making. Emma's confusion was understandable. From her perspective, my absence from Christmas would be inexplicable and painful. But her pain didn't obligate me to accept treatment that diminished my dignity. Love, I was learning, sometimes required disappointing people in the short term to preserve something more important in the long term. The grandmother who showed up when convenient might be easier for everyone to manage, but the grandmother who modeled self-respect would serve Emma better in the end. The call I'd been expecting came 2 days later, while I was at the kitchen table with my morning tea and the crossword puzzle. The phone's ring was sharp and insistent, cutting through the gentle quiet of the December morning like an alarm clock in a peaceful dream. "Mom, what the hell is going on with the bank account?" Michael's voice was tight with something between anger and panic, the tone he'd used as a child when he'd discovered that actions had consequences he hadn't anticipated. In the background, I could hear Sarah's voice, urgent and questioning, though I couldn't make out the words. "Good morning, Michael," I said calmly, setting down my pen and giving him my full attention. "Which account are you referring to?" "You know which account. The joint account. They said you transferred most of the money out, and when I tried to access the statements, they said I wasn't authorized anymore. I've been managing your finances for 3 years, Mom. This doesn't make sense." The word managing hung in the air between us, loaded with assumptions about competence and control that I was no longer willing to accept. When had my finances become something he managed rather than something I owned? When had my money become subject to his oversight rather than my direction? "I've opened my own account," I said instead. "I'll be managing my own finances from now on." "But why? Has someone been telling you that you need to, that I've been?" "No one has been telling me anything, Michael. This is my decision." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of words neither of us was ready to say. I could hear him breathing, could almost see him struggling to recalibrate his understanding of who I was and what I was capable of deciding for myself. This is about Christmas, isn't it? He said finally, his voice strained. You're punishing us because we said it would be easier if... I'm not punishing anyone, I interrupted gently but firmly. I'm making choices about my own life. There's a difference. Mom, you can't just... He stopped himself, seemed to regroup. When he spoke again, his voice carried the careful control of someone trying to manage a difficult situation. Look, if you're upset about Christmas, we can talk about it. Maybe we can figure something out. You cannot be a guest in the house you built. The phrase came to me with the clarity of absolute truth, crystallizing everything I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. I had built this family, nurtured it through decades of small sacrifices and large love. The idea that I needed to earn my place at a table I had set for 40 years was absurd, insulting, and completely unacceptable. I appreciate that, Michael. But I've already made my plans for Christmas. I hope you, Sarah, and Emma have a wonderful holiday. What plans? Mom, you don't have anywhere else to go. The assumption in his voice, the casual dismissal of my capacity to create my own meaning, my own joy, clarified everything. In his mind, I was a woman without resources, without options, without the ability to find fulfillment outside the narrow role he and Sarah had carved out for me. I have my own home, I said quietly. And it turns out that's somewhere after all. I ended the call on my own terms, not his, setting the phone down with the same quiet finality I'd used the day this all began. The kitchen around me felt different afterward, not empty, but spacious. Not lonely, but peaceful. The butcher shop was cold and bright, fluorescent lights reflecting off stainless steel surfaces and glass cases filled with carefully arranged cuts of meat. The air smelled of sawdust and cold storage, sharp and clean, with an underlying richness that spoke of quality and attention to detail. I'd dressed warmly, the navy coat again, leather gloves, a wool scarf that Harold had given me years ago, and that still carried the faint scent of his cologne. I'd like to order a turkey, I told the butcher, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and hands that moved with the precision of decades of practice. How many people will you be serving? He asked, pulling out a notepad and pen, ready to make recommendations based on my needs. That's not important, I said, studying the case and the care with which he'd arranged everything. I want the best turkey you have. 20 pounds, fresh, not frozen. I'll need it ready by Christmas Eve. He looked up from his notepad, seemed to register something in my tone, not arrogance, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and was prepared to pay for it. Special occasion? He asked. You could say that. I studied the case, noting the careful arrangement, the pride he took in his work. Everything was clean and well presented, evidence of someone who understood that food was more than sustenance. What would you recommend for the stuffing? I want to do this properly. We talked for 20 minutes about brining and seasoning, about cooking times and temperatures, about the difference between fresh and frozen, and why it mattered. He wrote everything down for me, his instructions precise and generous, offered with the enthusiasm of someone who loved sharing expertise. You'll want to start the brining process 2 days before, he said, sketching out a timeline. And here's the thing about temperature, most people cook it too hot and end up with dry meat. Low and slow, that's the secret. When I paid, with my own card, from my own account, I felt the satisfaction of a transaction completed entirely on my own terms. This wasn't about feeding a family or fulfilling an obligation. This was about creating something beautiful because I could, because I chose to, because the act of creation itself had value independent of its audience. The turkey, when he brought it out to show me, was magnificent. Plump and pale, skin tight and unmarked, it was exactly what I'd asked for. Beautiful and substantial and entirely unnecessary for one person. Perfect, I said. I'll see you Christmas Eve. As I walked back to my car, the butcher's instructions folded carefully in my purse, I understood something with startling clarity. I was buying a centerpiece for a memory that was no longer mine. The letter took me 3 drafts. The first attempt was too angry, full of grievances and justifications that served no one. I'd poured out years of accumulated hurt, listing every slight and dismissal and moment of feeling invisible. But reading it back, I'd realized it would only create more pain without resolving anything. Revenge disguised as honesty was still revenge. The second was too apologetic, hedging and explaining in ways that undermined the very boundaries I was trying to establish. I'd found myself justifying my choices, asking for understanding rather than simply stating what would be. But the explanation suggested negotiation, and this wasn't negotiable. The third was clean and honest, repair instead of revenge. I chose good paper, cream-colored stationery I'd received as a gift years ago and never used, heavy stock that felt substantial under my pen. The pen was Harold's favorite, the one he'd used for important documents and letters of condolence, a Mont Blanc that wrote smoothly and carried weight. The words came slowly, each one chosen with care. Dear Michael, Sarah, and Emma. The turkey I'm leaving for you today is my gift and my goodbye to the role I've been playing in your family. It's prepared with love, just as everything I've ever brought to your table has been, but it represents the last time I'll provide what you haven't asked for. I want you to know that this isn't about anger or punishment. It's about recognizing that the life I've been living, always available, always accommodating, always grateful for whatever space you had room for, wasn't serving any of us well. Michael, you deserve a mother who stands up straight and speaks her mind, not one who apologizes for existing. Sarah, you deserve a mother-in-law who respects your authority in your own home. Emma, you deserve a grandmother who models dignity and self-respect. I'm not disappearing from your lives, but I am changing the terms of my participation. From now on, I'll be available when invited, present when wanted, and absent when that would be easier for everyone. The turkey is of excellent quality. Cook it at 325 degrees, 20 minutes per pound. It will serve your guests beautifully. With love and respect for the family you've built. Mom. I sealed the envelope with care, running my finger along the seam to make it permanent. The most important things are said when there is no one there to argue. Christmas morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of day that makes the world look newly minted. I'd been awake since 4, not from anxiety but from the strange anticipation that comes with momentous occasions. The turkey had been ready since midnight, golden and perfect, cooling in the kitchen while I wrapped it in towels and packed it into the insulated carrier I'd bought specifically for this purpose. The brining had worked exactly as the butcher promised. The skin was crispy and bronze, the meat tender and fragrant with herbs. It was a masterpiece of technique and patience, the kind of dish that would be the centerpiece of any celebration. I'd prepared it with the same attention I'd given to every holiday meal for the past 40 years, but this time the love was for the process itself, not for the recipients. The drive to Michael's house took 15 minutes through empty streets. The whole neighborhood was still sleeping, windows dark behind curtains, driveways empty of the bustle that would come later when families gathered for their celebrations. Christmas lights glowed softly in the gray dawn, and somewhere a church bell was ringing, calling people to early service. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment, engine cooling, looking at the house where my family lived. The windows were dark, the front porch empty except for the decorations Sarah had put up weeks ago, tasteful wreaths and garlands that looked like something from a magazine. Everything is perfect and planned, excluding me. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I was seeing it with different eyes. It was just a house, after all, wood and brick and glass, filled with people who happened to share my blood but who had made it clear that sharing space was more complicated than sharing DNA. I pulled the carrier from the back seat, heavier than I'd expected, and walked up the front path with steady steps. The porch was wider than I remembered, perhaps because I wasn't approaching it as a supplicant. The welcome mat was new, decorated with holly and berries, cheerful and seasonal, and addressed to visitors who were actually welcome. I set the carrier down carefully next to the front door, placed the letter on top where they couldn't miss it, and stepped back. For a moment, I stood there in the cold morning air, looking at what I'd done. The turkey in its carrier, the envelope white against the dark insulation, the evidence of care and preparation, and final service. It looked exactly like what it was, a gift and a farewell, an act of love and an act of liberation. I wasn't dropping off a meal. I was dropping off a role I would no longer be playing. I rang the doorbell once and walked away. Behind me, I heard the sound of my own footsteps on the front walk, crisp and decisive in the morning stillness. Each step took me further from the life I'd been living and closer to the life I was choosing. I didn't look back, didn't wait to see who would answer the door, didn't linger for a confrontation or explanation that would serve no one. By the time I reached my car, a light had come on in an upstairs window. By the time I started the engine, I could see movement behind the front door's glass panel. By the time I pulled away from the curb, the door was opening, but I was already turning the corner, already heading home. The drive back felt different, lighter somehow, as if I'd been carrying something heavy for so long I'd forgotten its weight until I set it down. The morning was brightening, the sun beginning to burn through the thin cloud cover, and other cars were starting to appear on the roads as the neighborhood woke up to Christmas. When I pulled into my own driveway, the house looked welcoming in a way it hadn't for months. The windows caught the morning light, and the small wreath I'd hung on my own front door, simple greenery from my own garden, tied with a ribbon Harold had saved from some long-ago gift, seemed exactly right. Inside, the kitchen was warm and filled with the lingering scent of the bread I'd baked the night before. I made tea with deliberate care, warming the pot and measuring the leaves, creating the small ceremony that had become my morning anchor. While it steeped, I toasted a thick slice of yesterday's bread and spread it with butter and honey. The breakfast was simple and perfect, eaten while standing at the kitchen counter in my stockings and robe, looking out at my small back garden where the lavender plant sat on the windowsill, purple and fragrant and entirely mine. The phone didn't ring. The doorbell remained silent. The morning stretched ahead of me, unmarked by obligation or expectation, a blank page waiting for whatever I chose to write on it. I thought about calling Mrs. Chen, asking if she'd like to share a pot of tea and watch the snow that the weather forecast had promised. I thought about the book I'd been saving for a quiet day, the one that had been sitting on my nightstand for weeks while I filled my evenings with worry and planning. I thought about the art supplies I'd bought on impulse months ago, still in their bag in the closet, waiting for a moment when creating something beautiful seemed more important than maintaining something broken. For the first time in years, I had choices that belonged entirely to me. The snow began falling just after noon, fat flakes that drifted past the kitchen window like blessings. I watched it settle on the bare garden, covering the brown earth with clean white possibility, and understood something that had taken me 67 years to learn. My peace was not a gift from them to take back. It was a garden I had to plant myself. I spent the afternoon in that garden of peace, reading and dozing in Harold's chair, listening to the quiet sounds of my own home settling around me. When evening came, I made myself a simple dinner, soup and fresh bread, a glass of wine that caught the lamplight like liquid amber, and ate it by candlelight at my own table. Later, much later, when the snow had stopped and the world outside lay hushed and perfect under its white blanket, I heard a car in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see Michael's headlights cutting through the darkness, and I could make out his familiar silhouette as he sat behind the wheel for a long moment before finally getting out. He walked slowly up the front path, and I could see in his posture all the weight he was carrying, confusion and hurt and the particular bewilderment that comes when someone you thought you understood completely reveals themselves to be a mystery. He rang the doorbell, and I went to answer it. "Mom," he said when I opened the door. His face was red from the cold, his eyes uncertain. "We need to talk." "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "I'll make tea." As I filled the kettle and set out cups, he stood in my kitchen looking around as if seeing it for the first time. The lavender on the windowsill, the loaves of bread cooling on the counter, the notebook still open to my lists, the small signs of a life being lived deliberately and with intention. "The turkey was perfect," he said finally. "Emma cried when she read your letter." "Well, when Sarah read it to her." I said nothing, just waited for the water to boil, giving him space to find his words. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening." Everything seemed fine, and now suddenly you're... I don't know what you're doing. I'm living, I said simply. Maybe for the first time in a long time, I'm actually living. He was quiet for a moment, processing this. But we're your family. We need you. You need someone, I agreed, measuring tea leaves into the pot. But it doesn't have to be me, and it doesn't have to be on your terms. The kettle sang, and I poured the water over the tea leaves, beginning the ritual that had become my meditation, my prayer, my way of marking time in a life that finally belonged to me. I don't know how to do this differently, he said, and for the first time, his voice carried the confusion of a child who had lost his way. Neither do I admitted, bringing the tea to the table where he sat hunched over like someone carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. But I know we can't keep doing it the old way. We talked until nearly midnight, not solving anything, not fixing what had been broken, but perhaps beginning to understand that some things needed to be broken before they could be rebuilt properly. He told me about the pressure he'd felt to take care of me, about his fear that I was fragile and needed protection. I told him about the slow erosion of my place in their lives, about the way accommodation had become invisible. I just wanted to help, he said at one point, his voice small. I know, I told him. But help looks different from the inside than it does from the outside. When he finally left, he hugged me at the door, really hugged me, not the polite embrace of duty but the fierce hold of someone trying to memorize the feeling of safety. I love you, Mom, he said. I know, I told him. And I love you too. That's not what this is about. After he drove away, I stood at the front window watching his taillights disappear around the corner, red dots swallowed by the snow and darkness. The house settled around me, warm and quiet and patient. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to my own bedroom, to my own bed with its clean sheets and soft pillows. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world with the promise of morning. In my dreams, I was planting a garden. The soil was dark and rich, and the seeds I scattered grew into things I had never seen before, not flowers exactly, and not vegetables, but something entirely new. Something that bloomed with the particular beauty of choice freely made, of boundaries honored, of love given without the expectation of return. When I woke on the morning after Christmas, the world outside was transformed. Snow covered everything, the garden, the sidewalks, the bare branches of the old oak tree, in pristine white silence. The sun was shining, and the kitchen window threw rectangles of golden light across the floor. I made my morning tea and stood at the counter, watching the neighborhood wake up to this new landscape. Children would emerge soon, excited by the snow, and the sound of their voices would carry across the winter air like bells. But for now, in this moment, there was only peace. Only the warmth of the tea in my hands, the scent of lavender from the windowsill, the gentle weight of a life that finally fit properly. I had planted my garden, and it was good.